So it is, I think, 668-ish days until the 2020 election. And even the Iowa caucuses, the first big battle of the next primary, is like 11 months away. But this is America, so we're already in the thick of the election. And it is manifested online in a number of proxy wars, battles going on around potential candidates, ones who were declared, ones who might theoretically declare. And I have noticed that many of these battles have very little to do with the substance of the policies those people might push for were they to become the nominee. That has been a trend. And I want to welcome to the show now someone who apparently has noticed a bit of that as well. This is senior politics editor and columnist for The Intercept, Brianna Gray. Welcome to Rebel HQ.
Thank you for having me.
Very glad to have you here. So I noticed your recent article on The Intercept about identity versus sort of policy and substance in terms of conversations about candidates. And I want to talk to you about that. But for those who might not have read the article, if you could explain the thesis of it.
Well, basically, I started noticing a trend, particularly in the kind of aftermath of the controversy around Beto O'Rourke. You know, there were a series of articles, I think only maybe 3, that were critical of his both his policy record and the fact that he took campaign contributions from people in the oil industry. And the response from kind of the center left was that this was a coordinated campaign and all about the fact that, you know, Beto O'Rourke was this charming white guy and that Sanders defenders were just upset because he was encroaching on Sanders' turf, which in their mind was that Sanders is just a charming white guy and Beto is a better version. And it seemed part and parcel of a trend toward divorcing the ideological underpinnings, which I believe motivate people's passion for Senator Sanders and candidates like Ocasio-Cortez from these kind of more superficial identity type markers.
You know, that's interesting. There's already so much in what you said there. But so in your article, you give a couple of examples of people from either the center or the center left saying that the appeal of Bernie back then was his charisma. And the thing is, I consider myself one of the biggest Bernie supporters in the country. And I think he's very likable. But I don't think that I would rank on the top 10 list of his attributes charisma necessarily.
Yeah,
that seems like a weird rewriting of history.
Yeah, if anything, he's known as a kind of a curmudgeonly old guy who, you know, people like despite the fact that he's not particularly kind of gregarious or outwardly affable. I think the fact that he is not that kind of interpersonally charismatic that makes people trust him. You know, he has to lead with his values and his principles and his policy prescriptions. And unlike some other candidates, there's nothing else to distract from that. And that's part of how he's able to engender trust.
You know, and so you also pointed out that there was concerns or whispers that the attacks against Beto O'Rourke might have been coordinated to whatever, I don't know what that's supposed to mean in practice, but I do think it's interesting because I don't know if you remember this, but I'm old enough to remember when the Washington Post had 16 anti-Bernie Sanders op-eds inside of a one-day period. Maybe that wasn't coordinated, but it sure felt like it. And even more recently, some of the attacks against Elizabeth Warren, for instance, or certainly what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, new representative, has faced, those feel like they might be coordinated. Do you think that there might be a bit of hypocrisy in pointing out that as a bad thing?
I most certainly think that's the case. I mean, on a basic level, the volume, which is being pointed to as a coordinated attack, was so meager that it was kind of facially absurd. But what also it reveals to me is that there's such a distrust that there could be enough people in the world that had a genuine critique of someone like Beto, a genuine critique of a candidate, that you would jump to the conclusion that the critique was motivated by bad faith. Mm-hmm. It also shows how little people are actually looking to the substance of the critique, because one glance at it shows that it is substantive and needs to be addressed on its merits, unlike a lot of the critiques we saw of Bernie Sanders in 2016.
Yeah. So I want to talk about some ways that what you wrote about in the article could manifest in terms of the differences in strategy for how the 2020 primary should be run. So you hear conversations already about Joe Biden. Man, they love him in the Rust Belt, even though I haven't really seen much polling data to actually back that up. But the theory has always been, oh, they're going to love him there, or oh, this candidate might appeal hypothetically to one demographic in this particular area. And it seems in practice like that sort of talk is either just in effect or by design crowding out, well, what should they be pushing for? What is their ideology? What big plans do they have? If those people, if they maintain control and if they actually have sway over who the nominee is, how do you see this primary playing out?
My worst fear is that it plays out exactly as 2016 played out, with the end result included, which is why I'm really invested, and a lot of people are really invested in pushing these kinds of, policy-based discussions forward. And I think that's part of the magic and brilliance of Ocasio-Cortez, is because she has the full package in terms of folks who really invested in some of the identity markers, the more kind of like personal who you are markers, and obviously the policy chops, the left chops, and promoting these reforms like Green New Deal, not being equivocating on Medicare for all. And people who like her ultimately are going to have to grapple with the fact that liking her means accepting her policies. And it's going to be a lot more difficult, I think, at this time around to be wholly dismissive of kind of progressive initiatives as, litmus tests or somehow, superficial standards that we're only creating in defense of Bernie man as opposed to things that we support on their own merits.
Yeah, and it certainly seems like what you were talking about before about how we are just swayed by charisma. That's why we support these things. Bernie Sanders was no different in substance from any of these other politicians. The attempt to totally wash away their ideology or the big policies that they've proposed, that seems to be a heavy part of the criticism of AOC so far. I mean, especially in the wake of her talks about possibly raising the top marginal tax rate. I mean, I have heard her referred to as a little girl, about, she's savvy on the internet, she's good with Instagram. It seems obvious that people have been drawn in by the fact that she's potentially the best communicator in my lifetime for these left positions. Do you think that, we've mostly seen that from the right, do you think that there is going to be a turn where more people from the centrist Democrats are going to be attacking her on those grounds?
I mean, we've seen some centrists attack her already, and we've seen at very least some hesitation and skepticism from people like Nancy Pelosi. I was heartened to see today on The View that Kamala Harris was kind of baited into one of these questions about AOC by Meghan McCain, and she didn't take the bait. And she said that she appreciated that Ocasio-Cortez was introducing new ideas to the party, and that if the status quo can't be defended, then we shouldn't defend the status quo. I think that that's the smart take. We'll see how many of the 2020 crew actually adopt that, because as the race heats up and it becomes clear that Bernie Sanders is the candidate that is the standard bearer for those beliefs, and along with Elizabeth Warren, people are going to start to feel the need to distinguish themselves in different ways, and we'll have to see how this kind of like broad Ocasio-Cortez coalition starts to break apart, presuming, of course, that Bernie runs, and presuming, of course, that AOC backs him.
Yeah. So there's so much I want to talk about. So in the later parts of your article, you talk about how there is this battle in terms of how you define what a progressive is, and you give examples of some people who have at least traditionally have been identified more as centrists, that have, in some cases simply as a matter of branding, but in some cases with some policies have attempted to rebrand themselves as actual progressives. We are likely to have, if all of the people that we think are going to be running actually end up running, you're going to have a bunch of progressives. Some of them obviously progressives and some arguably progressive. So you just said that there's going to be this desire to differentiate yourself and make yourself stand out. One obvious way that you can do that is by proposing strong progressive policies. If they don't go in that direction, if a Harris or a Gillibrand or a Booker decide to go in other directions, how do you see that playing out?
Well, I think you're going to see the kind of experience canard thrown out like it is in every cycle, and that cuts different ways for different candidates. Obviously, someone like Joe Biden has a lot of incentive to talk about his experience. Someone like Kamala Harris, who's a fairly new senator, might not fare as well in that by that metric. Of course, there are other factors like being a first, which are meaningful and powerful to a lot of voters. And Kamala Harris obviously has an advantage of being, the only woman of color who's likely to run, ticking off 2 boxes that are, I think, very, very important. And then, of course, there are other factors like, being a first, which are meaningful and powerful to a lot of voters. And Kamala Harris obviously has an advantage of being the only woman of color who's likely to run, ticking off 2 boxes that are significant for their representational value. And I think when it comes down to a lot of these kind of new, the similarly new left candidates, I'll call them, the Gillibrands and the Harrises and the Bookers, those identity issues are going to be things that are more likely to distinguish them. I mean, why go with a Gillibrand or a Booker when you could go with a Harris and get more bang for your identity buck, I guess? We'll see how it turns out. Yeah.
So I want to ask you. This is I guess more of a gut, but you're very experienced in this area, so you probably have a well-tuned gut. Based on the conversations that have been going on over the past few months, where AOC has been able to redirect national attention to talking about a Green New Deal or about marginal tax rates, and now you have this wave of attacks. If right now, if you had to predict, where do you think we're going to end up after this primary?
Oh, who's going to come out on top?
Or even what type? Which wing do you think is going to come out on top?
That's very difficult because there is a lot of room to tack left. And it will be very interesting to see the extent to which some of the more similar like new left candidates cannibalize each other as there starts to be more, as everybody announces and they start to dialogue directly with each other. On some level, I feel like because they're only, the one true leftist is Bernie Sanders and also Elizabeth Warren, and there are 15, 16 other potential candidates that are distinguishable from them, there is a possibility that the left will have a little self-protective bubble for a while at least until the other crowd thins itself out. But I think the most challenging candidate for the more left candidates to beat are people like Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, particularly Harris, because she has been pretty adept of late at pivoting left, and because she does satisfy a lot of the representational value that a lot of Americans, not for silly reasons, but for genuine reasons, do also appreciate.
Yeah. Well, look, very much enjoyed talking with you about this. I have a feeling we will probably have cause for more conversations in this area as the primary progressives. After all, we have about 2 years of it. So I want to thank you, Brianna, for joining us. Very much enjoyed speaking to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Like what you see? Click the subscribe button below and don't forget to ring the bell to never miss another video from the Young Turks.